in English. I also apologize to the translators because I will not be sticking to the script. So, what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of the 3R project to orientate you as to where we're at. So, 3R stands for RDA Toolkit, Restructure and Redesign. And it's a confluence of at least 4 major changes which we felt we had to accommodate in RDA at some point. And what we decided to do is, foolishly, we would do the whole thing in one go. So the first driver of this project is to redesign the toolkit to be more modern and responsive. The original toolkit was not very compliant with standards for particularly users with disabilities, or as I prefer to say, people who have sensory preferences. So people who wish to access catalogues or materials that are visual rather than oral, etc. And of course, the other thing that's happened in the past 10 years is the rise of mobile devices and the need for displays that are adaptive to all sorts of devices. The second major driver is something hidden to everybody. It lies in the background, but the content infrastructure for RDA has been significantly upgraded from an old XML standard to the modern DITA or DITA standard. But this is entirely invisible to users of the toolkit. But it's very significant for the people who have to maintain the content because it makes it far easier. And there's a much bigger range of tools available for us to do this. We also wish to build on earlier successes in reusing RDA reference data, and I'll come back to that later to explain what that means. Perhaps the biggest impact professionally that we had to deal with is the publication of the IFLA library reference model. A major impact on thinking and modeling description and access. And finally, our masters are the RDA board, and they evolved a strategy roughly 4 years ago for the development of RDA, and we had to take that as a major driver during the project as well. So this is the one-line label that appears on the tin of RDA. It's a package of data elements, guidelines, and instructions for creating library and cultural heritage resource metadata that are well formed according to international models for user-focused linked data applications. And this sums up in one sentence rather a lot of things which I hope to demonstrate to you during the presentation. The actual content of RDA is split into 2 major components. There's the RDA Toolkit, which you use, and that provides the user-focused elements, the guidelines, and the instructions. It's what you need to do for your daily work. But we also have something called the RDA Registry, which provides the infrastructure for the well-formed data, well-formed in a technical, machine-readable sense, and also the linked data aspects of RDA. And these 2 sources of content interact with one another. So the library reference model was published last year, and as most of you know, it is managed by IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. This model consolidates the so-called functional requirements family of models, which began in 1998, which now seems like eons ago, when FRBR, Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, was first published. And then nearly 10 years later followed functional requirements for authority data, FRAD, rapidly followed by functional requirements for subject authority data, for SAD. And what a lot of people forget is there was another piece of the model produced by the Working Group on Aggregates in 2011. And then following those earlier models, the consolidation of the library reference model, it took another 6 years. The main difference here in what's happened over that period of 20 years of thinking about how we respond to the needs of modern retrieval lies in the labeling. So in 1998, everything was about records. But within 10 years, there was a conscious decision to refocus on the data aspects of this as the infrastructure for global information retrieval started to develop. The focus has moved to data, and that's very much something that the new toolkit has followed. What this means to RDA is highly significant. RDA was originally based on FRBR, most of FRBR, except for the Group 3, the so-called Group 3 entities. RDA also used a small part of FRAD, but by no means all of it. And we used all of FRSAD, but that's because FRSAD is a particularly elegant, simple model. Most of the subject description part of cataloging is out of scope for RDA. RDA does not cover subject analysis and description. And significantly, there was no adaptation of anything in the working group on aggregates, and that's because the report said do not adopt any of this until consolidation of the model, which then took a further 6 years. This has left huge gaps in the coverage of RDA. The original RDA really has very much an AACR2 focus on aggregates and serials, and so there's been an enormous change as a result of the consolidation of the aggregates modeling within the LRM. And I'll talk about that in a separate presentation later. So the publication of the LRM itself gave us a marvelous opportunity to fill in those gaps, the missing bits of RDA, and also reconcile incoherencies. There were incoherencies between FRBR and FRAD, for example, which is one reason why RDA did not adopt the whole of FRAD. So the question is should RDA continue to base its entire structure on this new library reference model? What are the reasons why we should continue to do this and invest in such a big change? And here are some reasons. So the LRM describes itself as a high-level conceptual model, which is intended as a guide or basis on which to elaborate cataloging rules. And this seems to support the idea that RDA is a package of guidance, instructions, and elements. The LRM also says that it operates at a greater level of generality than Ferber OO. Ferber OO is the object-orientated version of FRBR, and it's quite a different model, although it's compatible. But the main interest for RDA is that FRBR-OO is an extension of the SciDoc CRM, which is used by the museum community. And this is a strong indicator that this model is suitable for RDA, which wishes to extend its coverage to the needs of the collections of cultural heritage communities, including museums and archives. And finally, the LRM very clearly states that the model is developed very much with semantic web technologies in mind, so it clearly supports the the strategic driver to develop RDA for linked data communities. So these are sufficiently good reasons for us to remain within the IFLA model environment and to align ourselves very closely with that model. So I remind you, it's a high-level conceptual model. This means that it's not actually intended to be used as is, although you're welcome to try, but it's very, very high level, very, very broad, and therefore is unlikely to meet the needs of any real-world application, but it's not designed to do so. Like the previous models, it has an entity relationship structure, which is a universal, it's become a universal way of modeling and is easily transformed into other structures such as linked data. It's quite significant. As a model, it's intended for refinement by actual implementation. So RDA is an implementation of the LRM. And that refinement process is carried out by subtyping the entities, relationships, and attributes, the high-level ones that are given in the model. So by refining or subtyping aspects of the LRM, we end up with something we hope can be applied in the real world. So within the LRM consolidates the previous models. So the entities from those models which are still in the LRM are the familiar FRDR, four primary entities: work expression, manifestation, and item. And the entity person from FRDR is also retained. Corporate body is not retained in the LRM. You won't find it there. There's a double asterisk against person because person was treated in incoherent, incompatible ways between FRDR and FRAD. In particular, the concept of persona, that is alternative identities, which then got extended to cover fictitious entities and animals, and it just became very, very broad. So within the LRM, that has been pulled back in, and the person is defined as a human being, and nothing but a human being. So there's a significant difference there. But a number of entities have been added to the model. These include agents, which was predicted by RDA. So agent had appeared in RDA before we decided to undertake the project. There's another new entity called collective agents, which turns out to be a super entity of corporate body and family. The weirdest entity of all, which is Nomen, very, very weird entity, very, very interesting for people who like authority control. And place and time span, which are your standard subdivisions, as it were. It also includes another strange entity which people often misinterpret, called res, which is the Latin for thing. And this entity is a superclass of all other entities. It actually stands for anything at all you want. It's not very good if you're trying to be more precise with an application, but it's not intended to be used directly in applications. And I'll explain shortly what that actually is. So here we go. So the big question for the 3R project was, how big a change do we have to make in the RDA entities in order to make them compatible with the new model? So the first thing we did was declare our own super entity or superclass called RDA Entity. And it stands for anything of interest to RDA, and not just anything. It covers all the other types of entity, and technically is a subclass of LRM res, so it's entirely compatible with the LRM itself. My little orange down arrow there just indicates that wherever you see another entity, you can substitute RDA entity for it in your mind. So this is where the weirdness of nomen starts. RDA entity has appellation nomen. I put an asterisk against has appellation because there's one exception to what I have just said, which is nomens do not have appellations. Names do not have names, do not have names, do not have names. A rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. Otherwise, what this says is all things have names. And that's true. Otherwise, how could we refer to them? Any RDA entity can be associated with a place or a time span. This really is true. Nomens can be associated with a place or a time span. A name may be in use over a particular period of time and then fall out of use. It may be used in a particular place. Then collective agent is defined in the model as a subclass of agent, and of course everything in RDA is a subclass of RDA entity. And I should explain in this diagram that all of the ovals stand for entities, and any oval that has a full word in it is a new entity for RDA. So these are all new for RDA. But anything that just has an initial is already in RDA. And so we find that family and corporate body are subtypes of collective agents, so they fit the model even though they're not in the model. And then person, with that big change, is directly a subclass of agent. What this means is collective agent is defined as two or more persons acting in unison. And so we have one person doing it on their own, or we have two or more persons doing it collectively, and that's the whole range of things. Works, expressions, and manifestations now have creation relationships. This is nothing new. Publishers create manifestations, translators create expressions. What the model has done is really just clarified that and not reserved the act of creation to the intellectual act or conceptualization of a work. Here's another strange thing, which we all need to get used to, is items are not created by anybody. And that's because conventionally within the model, everything you say about an item, you actually transfer to the manifestation. And so all the creation relationships are described as part of the manifestation entity. And items are only distinct within, as a group, within a manifestation if one of the items is modified. So here we have to have modification by a human agent, so we do exclude the book which has been chewed up by the dog and then returned to the library. That is not a modification of an item, it's an accident. So that diagram shows that all of the existing RDA entities fit neatly within the model with some minor adjustments as well, minor relatively. So the beta release of the toolkit, we've spent a good part of the past 2 years looking at the toolkit, examining the model, finding out what we need to change in the toolkit to meet the model itself and the strategy, and do all that background re-engineering that I mentioned. And we decided to release what we had done so far in June, the beta release, so that we could start to get feedback from people. There has been a very radical change in the appearance of the toolkit. It has a significantly different design, but also the paradigm, the model that underlies cataloging at global level has significantly developed. And we want feedback from users, and so that we can make sure that we're capturing everything. It doesn't mean that we're going to reverse back to anything in particular, but we do want your positive feedback on this beta release. And this seminar is part of that process. So I hope there's going to be lots of questions. So what the beta release represents is the organization of the entities, attributes, and relationships in the LRM, as I've shown you on the previous diagram. The extension of RDA as an implementation of the model and the resolution of gaps and inconsistencies in RDA. And there are still some gaps and inconsistencies in the instructions and guidance. We're working on that. And also the explicit provision of recording methods. In the original toolkit, a number of different ways of recording the same data, as it were suggested for related relationship elements, for related entities. And we've explicitly extended that, those recording methods to cover all of the elements where appropriate. You'll hear more about those recording methods from Kathy. I'll mention them as well. But this allows data at various levels of quality to be accommodated within an RDA infrastructure. It means that applications of RDA do not have to do some kind of maximum research to find out how to specifically create a value for an element. There's a much wider range of data that can be accommodated within an RDA application. There's a shift of focus in the toolkit. The original toolkit combined the treatment of work and expression in one enormous chapter and similarly manifestation and item. And then parts additional elements as if they were second-class citizens in other chapters. The LRM and the needs of modern retrieval systems mean that we've tried to provide a more equal treatment, a more equal approach to entities. And we have refined the granularity of the toolkit down to the element. So I call it the unit of focus. The element is really the holistic piece. Elements are gathered together by the entities which they are applicable to. And then within each element, we have a regular structure. So what was previously a relationship designator, which basically had 3 lines of text in the original toolkit, now has a page all to itself. And that's true for every element in the new toolkit. We introduced new elements for access points. The original toolkit extensively describes how to construct an access point, but doesn't provide any elements to store the information. So we've added elements for access points explicitly. This is somewhat ironic because in the era of linked data, you don't actually need access points as much as you used to in the past. But RDA is trying to address a very wide range of needs. It isn't just about linked data. In fact, RDA is a set of guidance and instructions for constructing catalogue cards. You can even make them handwritten with a quill pen if you want. So it ranges all the way from traditional methods of recording information retrieval data up to the most modern. The distinction between attribute and relationship elements is very blurred. The LRM itself says basically even what the LRM calls an attribute element can in some implementations become a relationship and vice versa. And within the new toolkit, that distinction is now better represented by the particular type of recording method used for the data itself. So we have new entities added from the LRM. That means every time we add a new entity, we have to add relationships to the existing entities, so we have more relationships. every time we have a relationship, we construct an inverse relationship. So it's not all one way. You can start anywhere. You can start by describing the author and then go on to describe the work rather than the other way around. And the upshot of all of this is that there are many more elements in RDA than before, and don't all fall over. So we now have 13 entities, they're listed here, but we have well over 1,700 elements which variously describe aspects and relationships of those entities. Work wins the count prize with 388. The reason for that is that the relationships between works become much more important primarily as a result of the treatment of aggregates and serials, which I'll talk about later. The bottom line here, the absolute minimum number of elements that would ever be associated with an RDA entity is the ones associated with RDA entity, which is not intended to be used as is. It's a gathering mechanism, the same as res. But there are nonetheless 27 elements associated with RDA entity. All but one of them are relationships with other entities. And the one which isn't is note. Note on RDA entity is just a note. So don't be frightened by this. There is no way that we intend all 1,700 elements to be mandatory in the description of an information resource. No way. What we expect is different applications to choose which of the elements they want, and the choice is free. No matter what combination of elements you choose, we can guarantee that that data will be compatible and interoperable with everybody else's choice. So this is what it's about. We've evolved a modular structure for the toolkit. Instructions are now grouped by elements, by entity primarily, and then within an element they're grouped by the recording method that they apply to. This finer granularity, as I said, is more flexible for a wider range of applications. It's like having a giant Lego set. You can pick any set of bricks and you can build whatever building you want, but you know that it's using the same construction methods as somebody else's Lego building. Every element page has the same structure. So every element has a page, and each of those pages has the same structure. And the RDA reference data, remember one of our goals was to increase the reuse of this data. Those data are maintained and displayed separately from guidance and instructions. And the data are extracted from the RDA registry. The RDA registry contains linked data representations of RDA reference. This does not mean the registry can only be used for linked data applications. It's that we use the linked data format to store the information. But you can download this information and reformat it in any kind of compatible structure that you wish to use. So it contains all of the entities which in linked data or resource description framework are known as classes. It has all of the relationships and attributes, all 1,700 of them, and these are known as properties, and there is no distinction made in resource description framework between a relationship and an attribute. It contains all of the controlled terminologies from the RDA vocabularies, which are treated as concepts within RDF. It includes all of the translations, whether they are full translations of the toolkit or translations of RDA reference. And it includes maps, machine-readable maps. We already have mappings between RDA elements and ISBD, which are clearly now in need of revision. The ISBD review group itself is reviewing ISBD as a result of the library reference model. We have a mapping to the mark relator codes, And we've always had mappings to Mark 21, but in the last release of the toolkit, we've significantly altered the display of that mapping, and they are now brought down to element focus level. The whole of the registry, the whole of RDA reference, all of the data in it is completely open licensed. The only restriction on it is if anybody uses this data, we do require attribution or the by attribute. But this data can be used commercially without permission from us. We're doing this in order to foster the development of systems, interfaces, cataloging modules which use this data and which then need the guidance and instructions from the toolkit. So how do we use this data within the toolkit? Within the 3R projects, so the good news is we did not handcraft 1,700 element pages. That's not what we've been doing for the past year. And what we've done is we've generated at least 800 or 900 of those pages automatically from the registry, because the instructions, for example, for X designators are all the same. And so we've been able to use a mixture of templates and RDA reference in order to automatically generate the content of these basic pages. From now on, regular releases of the toolkit will be refreshed from updates to the registry, and they will not be updated by hand directly. So within the element page, the sections on definition and scope, element reference, and related elements are all automatically regenerated for each release. The entire glossary is generated from the registry. All of the vocabulary and coding schemes, the controlled terminologies, are generated from the registry, and the new relationship matrix is also generated from the registry. So in a standard element page, the blocks outlined in grey-blue here come directly from the registry without human intervention. So we only have to update the registry once, and the data appears through an extraction process in the element page when we update it. And all the stuff in orange is the individual instructions and guidance, which we have to maintain manually through an editorial process. So I mentioned the recording methods. They've been extended to all the elements. In the original toolkit, as I said, they were confined to just related elements in relationships. So in the original toolkit, you could describe a related entity as an unstructured description, or a structured description, or an identifier. What we've done is extend that to all the elements. Not all methods are applicable, and where they're not applicable, we say so. Curiously, the original toolkit simply doesn't mention linked data at all, anywhere. The only reference to URI occurs in an example. And, you know, in the second decade of the 21st century, this is an enormous oversight. So what we've done is we made the recording method of linked data explicit throughout the toolkit. So we've ended up with 4 recording methods, and our code word, our code project word, during the project was the 4-fold path. And some of the older presentations that you may have seen will refer to the 4-fold path. In the toolkit, we stopped the Buddhist joke, and we call it the recording methods. So something else we've been able to do with the new editorial infrastructure of the toolkit, in particular this move to the DITA standard, is we're able to reuse standard phrasing and standard blocks of text extensively in the new toolkit. So we refer to this as boilerplate. So components from guidance, instruction, and navigation that are reused in multiple pages in the toolkit are stored once and then moved in by machine as required when we publish the page. By storing once, it means we only have to update something once. So if we need to change a generic instruction, say for using guidelines for transcription, then we only have to update that once, and it updates automatically throughout the toolkit where it's mentioned. I think very importantly for this particular audience is that you only have to translate it once as well. So the French translation of the new RDA is not going to involve Daniel poring over 1,700 separate elements, one a night. How long would that take him? Well, 4 years. It's not going to be like that. And there's I would say 50 to 60% of the content is subject to either RDA reference, extraction, which is single update, or the boilerplate, which again is single update or translation. And clearly this is going to make translations into many languages far easier and cheaper to achieve, and we want RDA to be translated into as many languages as people require. The upshot of this then is repetition is a desirable feature of the new toolkit. We've had some initial feedback from people saying it's too repetitive, it's getting boring. But my response to that is it's not supposed to be a good bedtime read. You know, we don't really intend you to take it in a bath, you know. And it's a kind of manual. It's there to do a job and not to necessarily be a good literary effort. So repetition is desirable. It improves consistency, and once you've understood one bit, you understand the rest. It supports the modular editorial infrastructure, which means that we can be far more responsive to proposals for change once they're accepted by RSC. We should be able to turn around things within just 1 calendar month instead of the 3 or 4 months that it takes with the current toolkit. And it reduces costs. So the other big complaint we get is it costs too much. Well, you know, it does. It costs an awful lot. It costs the time of all of the volunteers here. Their institutions pay for RSC membership time. We have to meet. There are traveling expenses, etc. And so it's a costly business to maintain an international standard. But by making the editorial features as easy to do and as efficient to do as possible, we are keeping costs down as low as possible. And here's my third bugbear. There are no rules. There never have been any rules. If you type the word rule into the current toolkit, you are not going to get any hits, 0 hits, because there never have been any rules. That is an AACR2 concept, and we abandoned it 12 years ago. There are no rules. There are lots of instructions, and many of them have become optional, and this is causing consternation in the more traditional user communities of RDA. People feel that something that's optional introduces uncertainty, but this is not the intention. It just means that we're providing different ways of doing things for different communities, not just the traditional Anglo-American communities, but around the world. Different cultures have different ways of describing their resources, and their users expect to use different ways of retrieving it. So by making the instructions optional, we're accommodating a much wider range of local practice within a global framework. And this local practice can be local in terms of type of material, so special materials, cataloging, manuscripts, audiovisual, etc. are accommodated on an equal level with, say, the differences in constructing name authorities in Indonesia versus Japan versus Canada, for example. I've mentioned already that all the instructions are assigned to recording methods, and we hope this makes it easier for users to understand the context of the instructions. The result is much more choice. This is really great for flexibility and really terrible for a cataloger who just wants to get on with their job. And, why should I spend 10 minutes choosing something? I just want to do it. Tell me what to do. I'll come back to that. I'm not going to leave that one hanging. Optional instructions then. Why are these instructions optional? A result of the strategy of internationalization. There is no one way, never has been one way, of describing and accessing a resource. Google is a clear counterexample to this. Google recognizes no library standards whatsoever, yet it's a pretty good resource retrieval engine. It turns out that two or more recording methods are valid for many of the elements. In fact, the majority of elements, you can use any of the four recording methods. And so there's a choice there, which recording method do I choose? They come with penalties. An unstructured description is just a note, so it's very easy. Structured description you have to think about, so it's going to take a bit longer. And if you're using a linked data system and using the IRI recording path, then your vendor needs to supply a huge infrastructure behind that in order for you to use that option. No elements are mandatory. They never have been. There's no mandatory in the original toolkit. And there is something called core, which has been removed from the new toolkit, but we do have a substitution for it. So no element is mandatory except nomen string, because nomen is really, really, really weird. And that's all I'm going to say. So the result of all of this is most instructions are now optional. And how you make the choice, how you manage choices, and by manage I mean cataloging managers, institutional managers, how those choices are made or transmitted to the catalogers who are actually doing the work is through something called an application profile, which isn't a new concept. It was developed by the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative about 15 or 20 years ago. And in fact, we've been using application profile kinds of data throughout the original toolkit's lifespan in the form of policy statements, because they select, they say which recording method to use, etc. So an application profile basically answers the questions, what elements must I record? And you would appreciate that this will shift. If I'm recording a piece of music, then the stuff that is mandatory for my application is going to be significantly different from the elements that I might record for a printed text or a manuscript or a painting or an art object. What elements should be recorded? So these are desirable, but not mandatory. What elements can I repeat? In some applications, you may only want to have a single instance, or a limited number of instances, like the old rule of three. You can reimpose the old rule of three. Those of you who want to do so, through an application profile, we're agnostic, we don't care. And whatever choice you make is not going to be incompatible with somebody else who's not using rule of three. It just means that when you bring the data together, it's not going to be complete for one application and over-complete for the other. Machines will sort that out. What vocabulary should I use? The RDA vocabularies are suggested, but it's always been the case that you can use a local vocabulary for carrier type or whatever. And knew what recording methods should be used, and within those recording methods and within a single set of optional instructions, which option should I use? So this is what an application profile will do. What this means is that unless you're an expert in RDA, you are usually going to require some form of application profile in order to use it effectively and efficiently. I'll go off on a tangent here. People often say, so I'll preempt the question, is I don't know where to start. And the answer is there is no start, so we can't help you. You know, do I start with the author? I mentioned this already. Do I start with the work? Do I start with a note? You know, well, that depends on your application. It's your choice. It's not a book. It doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can go in at any point, and the navigation aids will take you around everything else. The application profile will act like a route map. So there are multiple ways we can offer already within the toolkit to encode application profile style information. There are bookmarks and notes, policy statements I've mentioned, the workflows and the other user documentation. These are all present in the original toolkit, but we have enhanced versions of these with more features coming with the new toolkit. And you can use external documents because we will be developing URLs which will take you through the paywall, not for free, you have to have authentication, but through the paywall directly to the option that is required. So the answer to tell me what to do is read the application profile or go through your catalog input form, filling it in piece by piece. When you need to look at instructions, you click, the instruction comes up. So the way that the APs are to be developed and which method you use very much depends on the context, what usage of the toolkit you're making, what it is you're cataloging, and to what extent you wish to share the metadata that results. Everybody assumes everybody wants to share everything, but that isn't really true. So here's a tiny example. We're still developing this, but the bookmark and the note feature can be used to record this kind of information. It's not very pretty, not elegant, and you have to do it manually. But if you're a one-man band cataloger working with a highly specialized collection, this would be the method I would recommend. Make your own bookmarks up with your own notes and then just follow the bookmarks. So when you make a bookmark, a little symbol appears within the toolkit, and when you click on the symbol, the note pops up. So this one for place of publication is saying to only use the structured description in this application and to record no more than 3 values. So I transferred the rule of 3 to places of publication because I can. And you get to these bookmarks from a list of bookmarks in your, I don't have a thing for that. So within your profile, you have a directory of bookmarks, and you just go through the directory. It takes you to the instruction, and that's how you navigate your way through for a particular application. Another new thing, new structure we've introduced is regularizing the conditions. So in the current toolkit, there's lots of if-then instructions. If some condition, then do this. One of the problems is it is really not very consistent. We also have for do constructions, so for this, do that. And it's all got kind of messy and complicated, and we can see future development, which I may or may not mention. But the result is that we've paid attention to the conditions and the fact that conditions govern to a certain extent how you use the toolkit. So if it's a musical resource, do this. So clearly you ignore that if you're not cataloging music. So the kind of resource being described is conditional, specific characteristics, it might be a condition, the existence of other data, particularly in authority control. So a lot of instructions will say, if you have recorded the name in this form, then record the name title in this form, and so on and so on. What used to be called an alternative in the original toolkit now falls out as an option for the same set of conditions. So it's just another option, but the set of conditions remains the same. And what we've called an exception in the toolkit actually introduces a new condition. So exceptions now just become a different set of conditions. So those things, for, do, if, then, alternatives, exceptions have all been reduced down to a single structure, which we hope will be eventually clearer to interpret. I know it's a bit freaky at the moment. This is what it looks like. So you'll see more and more of this appearing in the beta releases. So the conditions appear in an orange box, and there can be more than one, and all conditions must apply. This will all be in the guidance and help, so don't worry, you don't have to take notes. And then for that set of conditions, there will be one or more options, and they're given in these grey boxes. The options are not supposed to be mutually exclusive. Sometimes you will wish to use two or more options. They're also not meant to be exhaustive, so they do not cover every option. Cataloger's judgment is required for those exceptional cases. We can't cover all the options. The toolkit would triple in size. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about translations. Normally, Daniel would give you a whole presentation about translations, but we don't have enough time today, and Daniel's in a much more important role as MC. So I've already mentioned that the modular structure is intended to support translations using boilerplate. We're also going to increase the amount of standard phrasing that we're using within the instructions, so more repetition, unfortunately. And the reference in the registry is translated quite independently of the other toolkit content. So we have twice the number of languages in translation for the references we do for the toolkit. And that's likely to remain the case. In some countries where catalogers have English as a second language, and there are many countries like that, then it may not be necessary to translate the whole toolkit into English because the catalogers can understand it into a different language, so they can understand the English. But by translating the reference is the labels, the stuff that appears in the data, in your catalogs, the vocabularies. You know, content type in English can appear in French, and it does. And we can make all of the labels of sections, the recording methods, etc., appear in French. And so that's why some communities have chosen not to do a full translation of the toolkit, but just to do the RDA reference because it's public facing. All of the translated data is processed in exactly the same way as the English data. It's extracted using the same script. We just switch the language over. So the same infrastructure is used throughout for translations. I've recently been saying to people that even with English, we should think of the English version of the toolkit as being a translation of the model. See, so we're all on an equal basis here. We have to start with one language. It's English. But we are not now saying that everybody has to adapt to the English. What we do is we adapt the English to the needs of everybody, no matter what language they speak. We have a policy for languages. You can look it up. It's on the Steering Committee's website. And most importantly, the chair of the translations working group is our very own Daniel Paradis, and he's doing a great job. So to sum up, the new toolkit is a package of data elements, guidelines and instructions, blah, blah, blah. But I think, and we think, it's a package that meets the resource description and access needs of this 21st century. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Entendez-vous? Ça fonctionne? Alors, je suis sûr que certains d'entre vous auront des questions. I'm sure many of you will have questions for Gordon. So you're welcome to come and ask the question in the language of your choice. Vous pouvez venir poser la question dans la langue de votre choix. Si vous êtes à l'aise en anglais, je vous encourage à le faire parce que je n'aurai pas besoin de traduire la question en français pour mes invités, nos présentateurs, mais sinon, posez-la en français and I'll translate into English for our presenter.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Russian Shark from the University. I probably want to say that anything that can be put into a nutshell probably belongs in the first place. So I don't want to direct it. Essentially, what you're saying is that RDA is the new version of RDA is essentially a more extreme version of RDA, which is it is not a method for creating records. It is a method for recording digital data elements. When we force those CLC records, utility records to an RDA compliant, if I understand correctly, this essentially means that the individual data elements are compliant with RDA. It's nothing less present for absence of data elements. And for those, you have to go to your radio practice.
That's absolutely correct. In fact, another thing I'll say with this kind of question is that nobody has actually implemented RDA anywhere yet. Because Mark cannot handle full RDA. There's suggestion after suggestion going through the Mark Advisory Committee right now for accommodating new elements from RDA. But Mark does not accommodate the existing elements properly. It makes no distinction between the primary entities, SWEMI, for example. And we know that the data communities have faced tremendous problems in trying to so-called Ferberize Mark data. So you're absolutely correct. When the 040 code says it's RDA, that has to be interpreted as being RDA compatible, maybe in bits.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Any other questions? Oui.
I was just wondering, from a visual point of view, if from the March 21, the old RDA and the new RDA rules, you have 15% of cataloging into one catalog. Would that be confusing for the public?
So the question for the recording is that we now have a kind of hybrid situation with Mark 21 record. I've lost your question. So we have Mark 21, and I've already said that that's a hybrid mixture of RDA and not RDA. And now we'll have the new RDA, and so we may have three different kind of approaches present in the same record. And will this cause confusion to users? Well, I can't really answer the question on behalf of the users. I'll make the observation, however, that most catalogs I'm aware of are full of RDA records, non-RDA records, pre-AACR records. Does that cause confusion to the users? I don't know. Well, I guess the users aren't really complaining, so it can be not causing too many problems. But I know, for example, the National Library of Scotland, I live in Scotland, National Library of Scotland has got pre-AACR records in it, you know, so it has like 7 or 8 different standards represented in a single retrieval interface. And that's traditional, that's the legacy problem. What's facing the larger libraries right now is a deluge of metadata that hasn't seen any standard at all applied to it, coming from publishers, coming from crowdsourcing, and we simply do not have the resources to curate it to any standard. That's being poured into user interfaces. Is the user going to get confused again? I don't know. But I do know that the huge variety of standards and data is the reality. And the larger the institution, as time goes by, the bigger and bigger the problem is becoming. And RDA is designed to allow those institutions to put that data into places like an unstructured description within RDA, so that it can be curated, catalogers can be trained, and help aids for end users can be developed in the most effective and efficient way. That is only using one framework rather than dozens and dozens of different ones.
I have just another question, it's a bit different. Like in designating person, you use right like an administrator. But in French, a female administrator is written differently. So will there be a difference in the glossary or the terms?
So another very interesting question that we've been thinking about. So we may have a single term in English for a role, a relationship, a designator. And in another language, that role may be differentiated out by using 2 different words. And so currently we have 2 approaches. We're still talking to the translations working group about this. This is a known problem. There are 2 methods of tackling it. One is to use alternative labels, which is not very satisfactory for the people speaking the language. Another approach is to refine RDA using the same mechanisms that RDA uses to refine the library reference model. So we could subtype the relationship into the 2 French subtypes. That's another method. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages. So we're still thinking about that, but it's a serious problem for translations.
Because I did in fact, in the business reference, they say you could use Illustrator, but in the authority record, you choose to use the email because then it will be taken from the area. So one place you could.
Yeah, and an application profile would tell you which one to do. And I have to say also that there's an even bigger problem for languages which are gender-based or inflected, because English doesn't use genders or inflections. And so we have severe problems with the English use of the male form. Because in some cultures, although in the West we've tended to say, well, you know, I'm not going to go into the arguments, but we'll choose the male version to stand, you know, man stands for all mankind. But that's not acceptable in languages which inflect the word. You have to have, Spanish is the first language we came across the problem with. You have different endings depending on whether the author is male or female. And if you don't make the difference, then the end users, they don't get confused. They are appalled because it's like they're reading garbage. So it's a severe problem, but we're aware of it and we're trying to tackle it. So all advice and feedback is most welcome.
Thank you.
Le temps pour une autre question. We have time for one more question before the break.
Thanks for your presentation. And just thinking, as people are working with BibFrame, like linked data, how does new RDA structure, look for all of that, and how does it fit together, and then we will see for the future with linked data RDA.
So the question is how does RDA fit with the linked data initiatives such as BibFrame that are going on elsewhere? Well, the first observation is we're all using resource description frameworks, and that's the power of using RDF. So there are plenty of methods available in the linked data communities for machine matching and correlation of data using different schema. So I mentioned the mappings earlier. So we have a mapping between the RDA elements and the ISBD elements. They're both linked data mappings. They're both linked data representations, and the mapping itself is also linked data. So you could take data that is using RDA elements and using a pure machine process, using semantic inferencing, for example, you can, like we call it dumb up, you remove the Ferber parts of that because ISBD is not a Ferber model. You remove the Ferber aspects of it, and then there's a map from the non-Ferber versions of the RDA elements to the ISBD. Now, this is not something catalogers need worry about, but we have created in the registry an entire set of corresponding elements which have no further constraints. So they don't mention works, expressions, or persons. They mention resources and agents. And so that's how we intend to make RDA data compatible with, say, BibFrame data, or schema.org, or ISBD, or any of the others. And when any of these schemes becomes stable, as with ISBD, of course now they're reviewing it, so we're going to have to redo it all again. But when we feel that another vocabulary or RDF linked data representation is stable, then we will start to work with that community to produce the mapping. And that's our strategic approach to this.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Merci à